In a letter posted to social media, the president cited both Canada's retaliatory tariffs, but also the fentanyl crisis as reasons for the increased levies.
Canada imposed its own reciprocal tariffs on the U.S. In light of these trade tensions. Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney did post a rather civil social media post and said Canada has made vital progress to stop the scourge of fentanyl in North America. We are committed to continuing to work with the United States to save lives and protect communities in both of our countries. It is important to note that according to the data, very little fentanyl actually appears to enter through the Canadian border.
On February 1st, 2025, Donald Trump signed executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on nearly all goods from Canada and Mexico. He didn't stop there. He suggested Canada should become the 51st state, calling the world's longest undefended border an artificial line that looks like it was done with a ruler.
And it would also be much better for national security. Don't forget, we basically protect Canada. But here's the problem with Canada. So many friends up there. I love the Canadian people. They're great. But we're spending hundreds of billions a year to protect it. We're spending hundreds of billions a year to take care of Canada. We lose in trade deficits. We're losing massive. We don't need their cars. You know, they make 20% of our cars. We don't need that. I'd rather make them in Detroit.
His advisors, Peter Navarro and Stephen Miller, believed these tariffs, launched under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, would force Ottawa into submission. They expected a desperate Canadian Prime Minister to arrive at the White House begging for exemptions. They were wrong. What happened instead was the most consequential geopolitical pivot in Canadian history. While Washington believed they were cornering Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney was building an entirely new economic architecture, one that doesn't require American permission to function.
To welcome Prime Minister Frieden to Canada. It's a great honor to have him here with his delegation, with your wife as well. We have a long friendship between our two countries. We can date back to part of this to when we hosted the royal family during the Second World War, and extending on to partnership that we're developing and deepening the coalition of the willing for Ukraine in finance, in defense, in space, and in other areas where we're exploring where we can work more closely together.
From an $11.5 trillion capital access deal with Luxembourg to visa-free travel with China, we're watching the systematic dismantling of Canada's dependence on the United States. But here's what makes this story critical. This isn't just about tariffs or trade routes. This is about whether a middle power can rewire its entire economic foundation in less than 12 months, and whether the United States can afford to lose the partnership that has defined North American stability for 80 years. The centerpiece of Canada's strategy isn't found in Toronto or Vancouver. It's in Luxembourg, a nation of 700,000 people that manages $11.5 trillion in global investment assets. That's not a typo. Luxembourg is the second largest investment fund center on the planet, where German pension funds, French institutional investors, and Scandinavian sovereign wealth funds pool their capital. When Luxembourg's Prime Minister Luc Frieden spent 3 days in Ottawa meeting with Mark Carney, they signed a financial sector policy dialogue. This wasn't symbolic, it was strategic infrastructure.
Thank you very much, dear Prime Minister, dear Mark. It's a great honor for us to be here today, not simply because it's nice to be in Canada to see the sun and the snow, but your voice is heard and appreciated in Europe. And so it is for us very clear that through the voice of the Canadian Prime Minister, Canada plays a key role in our thinking about the future of Europe and the world.
Carney effectively connected every Canadian infrastructure project, energy export, and critical mineral mine directly to European capital that Washington cannot threaten, sanction, or block. Here's why that matters. Luxembourg manages $11.5 trillion in total assets under management. Even if Canadian projects capture a fractional allocation, say 2%, that's $230 billion in new capital flows. That's nearly equivalent to Canada's entire annual export revenue to the United States. And its capital that doesn't flow through New York, doesn't depend on American approval, and doesn't disappear when Trump tweets. Think about what this means in practical terms. A lithium mine in northern Quebec no longer needs Wall Street financing. It can secure funding from a German pension fund looking for stable, long-term returns. A liquefied natural gas terminal in British Columbia doesn't need American energy companies as partners. It can work directly with Dutch and Belgian investors who want energy security independent of Russian supply. This is financial sovereignty, and it's something Canada hasn't had in generations. At Davos, 3 weeks before the Luxembourg deal, Carney delivered what many consider the most important speech by a Canadian leader in a generation. He told the global financial elite that the rules-based international order was partially fiction. He warned that middle powers had to act together or be consumed one by one. His message was direct. If you are not at the table, you are on the menu. Trump heard the speech and called it globalist. U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent claimed Carney was walking back his comments. Carney's response? He went before cameras the next day and said, "I meant what I said. No walking back, no retreat." That combination of intellectual credibility and refusal to capitulate changed how the world viewed Canada. Suddenly, invitations poured in. India, Brazil, Australia, the UAE, all wanted a piece of what they started calling the Canadian alternative. Within 48 hours of the Davos speech, Carney received calls from finance ministers in 7 countries. Within a week, formal invitations for state visits arrived from 4 continents. The message was clear. The world was looking for an alternative to American economic dominance, and Canada, with its resources and institutional stability, was the perfect test case. But before we go further, we need to understand how we got here. Trump justified the 25% tariffs by citing the fentanyl crisis and illegal border crossings. The problem with this rationale? Only 0.2% of fentanyl entering the United States comes from Canada. The vast majority comes through southern ports of entry. But facts didn't matter. The tariffs hit everything: steel, aluminum, automotive parts, energy, agriculture. The initial Canadian response under Justin Trudeau was fierce retaliation. Canada announced $30 billion in immediate counter tariffs on American goods, specifically targeting red states to maximize political pressure. Ontario and Quebec banned American liquor. Every bottle of bourbon and California wine disappeared from shelves overnight. Highway tolls for U.S. vehicles doubled in Nova Scotia. BC's liquor distribution branch halted all purchases from Republican-led states. Then came the leadership change. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England and Bank of Canada, became prime minister. And his strategy was fundamentally different. Where Trudeau engaged in tit-for-tat retaliation, Carney focused on structural diversification. He didn't just want to hurt American exports. He wanted to make Canadian exports less dependent on the American market entirely. Carney understood something that Trump's advisors did not. Canada's vulnerability wasn't its economy. It was its psychology. For decades, Canadians had internalized the idea that American markets were irreplaceable, that without U.S. trade, the Canadian economy would collapse. Carney's strategy was to prove that assumption wrong, not through rhetoric, but through signed agreements, capital commitments, and alternative trade routes. Within 6 months, Carney assembled 12 new economic and security partnerships. Let's walk through the most significant ones because each represents a deliberate move away from American dependency. First, the China pivot. Carney flew to Beijing and met with President Xi Jinping, ending an 8-year high-level diplomatic freeze. China agreed to grant visa-free access for Canadians traveling for up to 30 days. This is a privilege the United States does not have. American citizens still face complex visa applications, 140 fees, and weeks of processing time. This deal doesn't just help Canadian tourists, it fundamentally reshapes North American travel economics. Cities like Seattle, Buffalo, and Detroit have historically relied on Chinese Canadians and Chinese tourists transiting through their airports and hotels to reach Canada. With direct flights and visa-free access, that revenue stream is evaporating. Airport landing fees, hotel bookings, outlet mall shopping, all replaced by direct Vancouver to Beijing routes. More importantly, Carney negotiated a 6.1% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Compare that to Trump's 100% tariffs. While Trump threatened to permanently shut down Canadian auto manufacturing, Carney secured quotas and technology transfer agreements that keep Canadian production lines running and vehicles affordable. This is where the divergence becomes stark. Trump views tariffs as leverage. Carney views them as pricing signals that reveal where new partnerships can be built. The Chinese agreement also included something rarely discussed in Western media: a technology transfer clause for battery manufacturing. Chinese companies agreed to build 3 lithium-ion battery plants in Ontario and Quebec, creating 15,000 jobs. In exchange, Canada guaranteed long-term supply contracts for lithium, cobalt, and nickel from Canadian mines. This isn't just trade, this is industrial strategy. Canada is positioning itself as the critical link between Chinese manufacturing expertise and North American resource extraction. But China is only one piece. Look at the United Arab Emirates. Carney signed a $70 billion investment agreement and launched formal free trade negotiations. The UAE is positioning itself as the financial bridge between Asian capital and Western markets. By securing this partnership, Canada gains access to sovereign wealth funds managing over $1 trillion in assets. Look at India. After years of frozen relations over allegations of Indian interference in Canadian affairs, Carney accepted an invitation to the New Delhi AI Summit. This positions Canada to potentially follow the EU-India Free Trade Agreement currently under negotiation. India represents 1.4 billion people and a rapidly growing middle class desperate for Canadian agricultural products and energy. Canadian wheat exports to India have already increased by 40% since the summit. Pulse exports, lentils, chickpeas, and peas, are up 65%. These aren't marginal gains. These are structural shifts in where Canadian farmers are selling their products. In the Southern Hemisphere, Carney accelerated talks with Mercosur, the trade bloc including Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. That's 250 million people and the world's largest agricultural exporting region. For Canadian manufacturers, this opens entirely new supply chains that bypass American logistics networks. In the Arctic, Canada is deepening defense ties with Australia, purchasing advanced radar systems for Arctic deployment. This matters because Arctic sovereignty is becoming a flashpoint. As ice melts and shipping routes open, Canada needs partners who can project power in regions where American commitment is increasingly uncertain. Carney's goal is mathematical, not abstract. In 2024, 67% of Canadian exports went to the United States. Trump sees that number as leverage. Carney sees it as a vulnerability. His stated objective is to double non-American exports over the next decade, adding $230 billion in new annual sales. That would reduce U.S. dependency to roughly 50%. Still significant, but no longer existential. Now back to Luxembourg, because this is where the architecture of independence is actually being built. During the Prime Minister's visit, 3 immediate institutional steps were taken. First, the financial sector policy dialogue ensures that Canadian and Luxembourg officials meet regularly to discuss capital markets, regulatory alignment, and fintech innovation. This isn't bureaucratic theater. It's about giving Luxembourg fund managers the institutional comfort they need to allocate capital to Canadian projects. European pension funds are notoriously risk-averse. They need regulatory certainty, transparent governance, and counterparty confidence. The dialogue provides exactly that. Second, the McGill-Luxembourg Centre for Finance was established. This creates a direct pipeline for Canadian financial talent to be trained inside Europe's investment capital. Instead of Canadian experts flying to Luxembourg to pitch projects, they'll be the ones sitting inside Luxembourg managing the flow of European assets into Canadian infrastructure. That's a strategic inversion. It means Canada controls the narrative, the due diligence process, and the relationship management. Third, and perhaps most innovative, is the proposed Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank, the DSR Bank. This institution is designed to offer multi-year, low-cost financing specifically for defense and security initiatives, particularly in the Arctic. Traditional government procurement is slow, politically vulnerable, and subject to budget cycles. The DSR Bank allows the commercial sector to work directly with the defense sector, providing the kind of patient capital that long-term Arctic infrastructure requires. Think radar installations, deep-water ports, satellite communications, and icebreaker fleets. These are projects that pay off over decades, not quarters. American capital markets struggle with that timeline. European institutional investors do not. The DSR Bank also includes something unprecedented, a climate resilience fund. This fund will finance infrastructure designed to withstand the effects of climate change, reinforced coastlines, flood barriers, and upgraded power grids. European insurance companies facing billions in climate-related losses are eager to invest in preventive infrastructure. Canada is giving them the vehicle to do exactly that. While Canada was building, the United States was absorbing the self-inflicted damage of Trump's trade war. When the tariffs officially took effect in March 2025, U.S. stock markets reacted sharply. The S&P 500 fell 1.8% in a single day. The NASDAQ 100 dropped 2.6%. By March 10th, the U.S. market had lost over $4 trillion in value. The S&P 500 entered a technical correction, falling more than 10% from its peak. Now, correlation is not causation. Markets were already facing headwinds from rising interest rates and stretched valuations. But the tariff announcement accelerated the sell-off. Investors began pricing in reduced corporate earnings from higher input costs and potential retaliation from trading partners. Economists warned that the tariffs would cost the average American household roughly $1,200 annually in reduced purchasing power. Gas prices in the Midwest were projected to rise by 75 cents per gallon because the United States simply does not produce enough oil to satisfy domestic demand without Canadian imports. Canada supplies 60% of U.S. crude oil imports. Cutting that off doesn't increase American energy independence. It increases prices at the pump. In contrast, Canadian and Mexican stock markets remained relatively stable. Mexico's main index actually rose 6% during the same period, as investors bet that diversification away from the U.S. would benefit Mexican manufacturing. The Wall Street Journal editorial board published a scathing critique, calling Trump's strategy the dumbest trade war in history. They pointed out that launching an economic assault on your closest neighbors and largest trading partners made no strategic sense. Tariffs work when you're negotiating with a distant adversary over specific trade practices. They backfire when you're trying to coerce an integrated ally. Trump's primary assumption was that Canada's economy would collapse under the weight of tariffs, making annexation politically easier. Instead, he created a rally around the flag effect. A poll conducted in February 2025 found that 91% of Canadians wanted to decrease trade reliance on the United States. For the first time in modern polling, nearly 30% of Canadians described the United States as an adversary rather than an ally. That shift in public sentiment has real economic consequences. Canadian travel to the United States dropped 40% in a single month. That represents an annual loss of approximately $4 billion for the U.S. tourism and hospitality sectors. When Trump administration officials announced that Canadians staying in the U.S. for more than 30 days would be required to provide fingerprints and biometric data, the Buy Canadian movement gained even more momentum. Grocery stores in Ontario started labeling American produce with red stickers. Sales dropped 60% within 2 weeks. Canadian pension funds began divesting from U.S. equities, reallocating billions to European and Asian markets. This wasn't government policy. This was public sentiment driving economic behavior. Major Canadian retailers pulled American brands from shelves. Loblaws, the country's largest grocery chain, announced it would prioritize Canadian and non-American suppliers. Within 3 months, American food imports to Canada dropped by $2.3 billion. The cultural shift was equally profound. Canadian universities began rejecting partnerships with American institutions perceived as politically aligned with the Trump administration. Canadian filmmakers stopped shooting in U.S. locations, even when they offered tax incentives. This wasn't just economics, this was identity. For the first time in generations, Canadians were defining themselves not by proximity to the United States, but by distance from it. When Mark Carney finally met Trump at the White House in May 2025, the dynamic had shifted. Trump, perhaps sensing that his pressure campaign had backfired, was uncharacteristically complimentary. He called Canada a very special place and claimed he only sought friendship. But when Trump again floated the idea that Canada would be better off as part of the United States, Carney's response was measured but absolute. He told Trump, "As you know from real estate, there are some places that are not for sale. Having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign, it's not for sale. It won't be for sale ever." Trump replied with a "never say never," but the message was received. Trump began referring to Carney as the Prime Minister, a sharp contrast to his earlier habit of dismissively calling Justin Trudeau the Governor. However, tensions remain. In February 2026, Trump threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a critical new link between Detroit and Windsor. His stated reason? Canada's recent trade developments with China. This is the new reality of the North American relationship. The 80-year period where the United States was the reliable, uncontested anchor of the global trading system is over. As Carney put it, if the United States no longer wants to lead, Canada will find partners who do. But here's where we need to inject some strategic uncertainty. Is this pivot sustainable, or is it a temporary reaction to an unpredictable American administration? There are legitimate risks. Overexposure to China carries its own set of problems. Chinese investment often comes with political strings attached. Beijing has a history of using economic dependency as leverage for diplomatic concessions. If Canada becomes too reliant on Chinese capital or Chinese markets, it risks trading one dependency for another. European capital, while more stable, is also more conditional. EU pension funds require strict ESG compliance, transparent governance, and long-term political stability. Any major shift in Canadian domestic politics could spook those investors. Then there's the feasibility question. Carney's goal of doubling non-American exports sounds ambitious, but is it realistic? Canada's geographic proximity to the United States creates natural trade efficiencies that are hard to replicate. Shipping Canadian lumber to China costs more than shipping it to Ohio. The question isn't whether Canada can diversify, it's whether diversification can happen fast enough and at sufficient scale to offset potential American retaliation without causing short-term economic pain. There's also the question of what $11.5 trillion actually means. Luxembourg manages that amount in total global assets, but how much of that capital is realistically available for Canadian projects? If Canadian infrastructure captures even 2% of that pool, that's transformative. But if it captures 0.2%, it's symbolic. The dialogue and institutional framework matter, but execution will determine whether this is a genuine structural shift or a well-executed public relations strategy. What we do know is this: Trump applied pressure expecting submission. What he created instead were the conditions for Canadian independence. Every tariff threat produced a new partnership. Every ultimatum triggered a new trade route. Canada is no longer the isolated, cornered nation Washington expected. It is a middle power that has successfully plugged into the world's most powerful financial distribution networks. Whether that network delivers sustained capital flows or simply provides optionality during negotiation remains to be seen. Canada possesses resources the world desperately needs: potash for global agriculture, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements for electric vehicles and defense systems, natural gas and oil